Daniel, thanks so much for coming on.
Thank you very much. Always a pleasure.
Daniel, we see the banks, not just here in the United States, but in Europe as well, setting aside quite significant provisions for potential bad loans. What are your thoughts on that?
What we are seeing so far is the beginning of a set of provisions that are likely to increase. And the logic is very simple. Banks are being prudent and they want to set aside enough of an amount to offset the risks of rising non-performing loans and diminishing value of their asset base. Usually people tend to think that these provisions are very aggressive, but if we look at history, we can see, for example, that in the Eurozone banks, they still have about 3% of their total assets in non-performing loans. In the case of the United States, it's only 1%. So banks are intending to be prudent, and it's important, therefore, that they set aside as big an amount as possible in order to address the weakening of the balance sheet. I think that it's also important to understand that if the provisions are too large, they can always be unwound.
And do you think that a combination of the Fed and the central bank's actions at the beginning of the pandemic kind of combined with the support programs or support packages? We have mortgage support programs here in the United States, some forbearance. Do you think that the impact of the pandemic has been delayed somewhat, and maybe in the next half, for example, we might start to see these non-performing loans increase?
Yes, we have seen this in the past. Initially, the impact on non-performing loans seems relatively small because of the big incentive packages. But a solvency crisis is not solved with liquidity. And many of these stimulus packages don't address the problems of solvency that so many companies and households are getting into. And usually there's a lag of about 12 to 18 months. If you remember, for example, the crisis of the Eurozone, 2009 and 2010 seemed to be years in which there was almost no risk of a financial meltdown or of a financial crisis. Obviously, in this crisis, the situation of banks is much stronger than it was in 2009. But what we know as well is that the problems of solvency and the big rise in non-performing loans tend to happen between 12 to 18 months after the crisis hits. So that is why it's so important for banks to set aside strong amounts of provisions that allow them to cushion the blow in case that things turn nastier.
And have you seen in the data things like unemployment or different metrics like this? Have they started to catch up? Have the central banks bought the banks enough time and the economy enough time for things to spring back? Or would you have liked to see it spring back faster?
I would have expected a faster return to normality by July. If we look at, for example, jobless claims data, if we look at consumption, industrial production, they obviously show bounce and they obviously show some level of recovery. But I think that the recovery is much slower than probably we would have wanted, particularly in the employment area. And that is a key factor because, again, coming back to the credit environment, if unemployment doesn't start to come back to the levels at which it was in February, and we at the same time, for example, we see that some of the subsidies and supervised jobless schemes in the Eurozone are unwound, then the impact on consumption and the impact on solvency of households is likely to be quite severe. So we need to be at least very, very aware of the importance of the job market returning to normality as quickly as possible. In order to achieve that, governments need to pay more attention to small businesses and to newly created businesses, because those are the ones that help a very rapid recovery of the employment levels.
Daniel, thank you so much as always.
Thank you very much.